All right, so today we're diving into something pretty mind-bending, the connection between chaos theory and free will. Do those two ideas actually, intertwine?
Oh, yeah. It's a question that's been around forever.
It has.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to untangle it a bit today, using some insights from this book that tackles this very debate. But before we jump in, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. What exactly it is a chaos theory?
Well,
I mean, it's not just about things being totally random.
Right. It's not about pure randomness. Chaos theory, in a nutshell, is about finding the hidden order within what seems like utter chaos. It's about those unexpected patterns that emerge from simple rules.
Okay, so there's like a method to the madness.
Exactly. And the source we're looking at today, it actually starts with this great anecdote about a bunch of physics grad students who, after enjoying some herbal refreshments, got fascinated by a dripping faucet.
Okay.
They noticed how the drips seemed random, but also kind of rhythmic.
Wait, so you're telling me that even with something as random as a dripping faucet, there might be like an underlying order?
Yeah. It might seem counterintuitive, but that's what chaos theory is all about, uncovering those hidden patterns in seemingly chaotic systems.
I need to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
Okay, so hold on.
The book emphasizes how this applies to all sorts of things, from weather patterns to the stock market.
So you're saying even something as chaotic as, say, the stock market could be operating on a set of hidden rules. That's wild. Okay, so how does this all tie back to free will? I mean, when I first started thinking about this topic, it felt like chaos theory kind of supports the idea of free will. You know, if things are unpredictable, maybe that leaves room for our choices to actually matter.
Yeah, it's a tempting thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
We like to believe we're in control, but here's where we need to be super careful, not to mix up determinism and predictability.
Okay, let's break that down. What's the difference?
All right, so determinism basically means that every single event has a cause, even if we can't always see it.
Right.
Predictability, on the other hand, is about whether we can actually foresee those events.
So just because something's unpredictable, like let's say which song's going to come on shuffle next on my playlist, doesn't mean it's not determined by something like the algorithm.
Exactly. And this distinction is crucial when we're talking about chaos theory and free will. Just because the system is unpredictable, like the weather, or maybe even our own lives sometimes, doesn't mean it's not governed by underlying rules.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do we wrap our heads around this idea of hidden rules in systems that seem so unpredictable?
Well, the book uses this amazing visual analogy of a cellular automata pattern. So imagine a grid where each cell can be either on or off, and its state changes based on simple rules about its neighbors.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that even with simple rules, these patterns can evolve in incredibly complex ways and unpredictable ways.
You know, this reminds me of when I first saw one of those fractal images. I was blown away by how something that is so intricate could come from such simple rules. But how do we know there's still an underlying order to these patterns?
Well, here's the key. No matter how many times you run the simulation, with the same starting conditions and the same rules, the same pattern emerges. Imagine a specific shape, like a diamond, repeating itself within this seemingly random pattern. That's the determinism at work.
So even though it looks random on the surface, there's a set of instructions dictating how it unfolds.
Yeah.
It's pretty mind-blowing. But I still don't see how this connects to free will. If everything's determined by these hidden rules, where do our choices fit in?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the book actually dives into a couple of common misconceptions that people use to try and connect chaos theory with free will.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the first one?
It's what the book calls the freely choosing cloud.
Okay.
The argument goes something like this. Because chaotic systems are so unpredictable, they must not be deterministic, which means there's space for free will to operate.
But isn't that kind of like saying that? Because I can't predict what I'll have for dinner tomorrow. My choice is somehow free from all influence. But in reality, my decision will be based on, my preferences, what's available, and maybe even my mood that day.
That's a great way to put it. You've hit the nail on the head. Just because we can't predict something doesn't mean it wasn't caused by a chain of events. It might just mean we don't fully understand all the factors involved. The book gives this really interesting example about predicting criminal behavior. Imagine trying to predict back in 1922, which person out of 100 would develop impulsive, even criminal behavior 40 years later.
That would be next to impossible, right? There's so many things that could influence a person's life over 4 decades.
Exactly. But fast forward to today. With all the advancements we've made in genetics, now we could potentially make that prediction. by identifying a specific gene mutation linked to that type of behavior.
So does that mean free will only existed
Yeah.
back in 1922, before we had the scientific understanding to make that prediction? Of course not. Just because we couldn't predict it back then doesn't mean it wasn't caused by something.
You got it. The point is,
Right.
our ability to predict something doesn't determine whether it was caused or not. It just reflects our level of understanding.
Okay.
So we've busted the myth of the freely choosing cloud. But there's another misconception lurking in the shadows. The idea of a causeless fire.
A causeless fire. That sounds intense. Fill me in. A causeless fire. Okay, lay it on me.
So this one's all about how some folks try to use chaos theory to argue that because you can't always trace back a single definite cause for something, it means there's no one cause at all. And of course, they then take a flying leap to connect that to free will.
So because things can get messy and tangled up, they just assume there's no rhyme or reason to it.
Right.
I guess I'd see how that'd be tempting. Especially if you're really wanting to believe in free will.
Right. But the book points out how this kind of thinking ignores a really crucial point. Just because we can't always isolate a single cause doesn't mean there isn't one. It just highlights the limitations of our own understanding.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's like whenever we hit a wall in our understanding, we're tempted to fill that gap with free will.
It's a very human thing to do. We like to think we're in control. But the book uses this really compelling analogy to illustrate why this causeless fire idea doesn't quite hold up. It talks about this legal case where two fires started separately due to negligence in two different buildings. And get this, these fires ended up converging and burning down a building in between.
Whoa, that's a wild example.
Yeah.
So who ended up being held responsible for the damage to that middle building?
Well, initially, neither owner was held responsible because they could each argue that even if their fire hadn't happened, the other fire would have still destroyed the building.
So they were both trying to pass the buck, basically.
Yeah.
Saying, not my fault, it would have happened anyway.
Exactly. But the courts eventually ruled that it's totally possible to be partially responsible, that there can be fractions of guilt. Even though it was a complex situation with multiple factors at play, you could still trace back the contributing causes.
That makes sense. Even if it's not a simple one-to-one cause and effect scenario, you could still see how different actions led to that outcome. It reminds me of those choose-your-own-adventure books, where even though there are multiple paths, you still end up somewhere based on the choices you make.
I like that analogy. And, this whole idea of converging causes actually pops up in a rather unexpected place, firing squads.
Firing squads, now that's a curveball. How do those tie into this?
Well, to try and ease the guilt of the soldiers, some firing squads would have one soldier randomly assigned a blank bullet. That way, no one knew for sure who actually fired the fatal shot.
Wow, talk about a mind game. It's like they're trying to create a sense of shared responsibility so no single person feels the full weight of what they've done.
It's a fascinating psychological tactic, isn't it? And there's a similar setup with lethal injection machines, where two people press buttons, but only one delivers the lethal dose. It all comes back to this idea of diffusing responsibility by introducing uncertainty about who was ultimately the cause.
So in a way, it's an attempt to create a kind of artificial indeterminism, even though the end result is still predetermined.
You nailed it. It highlights how our perception of cause and effect can be manipulated even in really intense situations. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that the outcome was already set in motion.
Okay, my brain is doing backflips trying to keep up with all this. So we talked about the freely choosing cloud and the causeless fire. But the book also dives into this other concept called convergence, right? Something about how even in chaotic systems, things can end up at the same destination, even if they take different paths.
You're exactly right. And this is where things get even more nuanced. Remember that cellular automata we were talking about? Well, it turns out you can sometimes have two totally different starting states that ultimately lead to the same pattern.
Wait, seriously? So it's like if you and I started in different cities, but somehow both ended up in, say, Paris, even though we took different routes to get there?
Precisely. And this whole phenomenon of convergence basically throws a wrench into the idea of linear causality. It means that you can't always trace back the exact path that led to a specific outcome in a chaotic system. And this is where some people try to sneak free will in through the back door.
I see it now. They're saying, aha, if we can't pinpoint the exact cause, then maybe there isn't one, and that means our choices are free.
Clever, right? But ultimately flawed. Just because we can't see all the threads doesn't mean they're not there. The book emphasizes that this is just another way we try to fill in the gaps in our understanding with free will.
It's like we're looking at this incredibly intricate tapestry, and because we can't see every single stitch, we assume some parts of it must be magically appearing out of thin air.
Exactly. But the book argues that even though we might not be able to see the whole picture, the tapestry is still woven together by cause and effect.
So chaos theory is basically saying, hey, things are way more complex than you might think, but that doesn't mean there isn't a reason behind the madness.
That's a great way to sum it up. And, this whole conversation about convergence actually ties back to something we were discussing earlier. The book points out how this idea of converging causes has even played out in some pretty unexpected settings, like firing squads.
I mean, we're back to firing squads. I thought we were done with those.
I know, right? But it's a really interesting connection. Remember how we were talking about how they sometimes use blank bullets to diffuse guilt among the soldiers?
Yeah, it's like they're trying to create a situation where no single person can be definitively identified as the cause.
Exactly. And the book argues that this whole setup is a way of introducing a kind of artificial indeterminism, even though the outcome, the execution, is still predetermined. It plays on our human need to find a single clear-cut cause, even in situations where that might not be possible.
So it's another example of how our perception of cause and effect can be manipulated even in life or death situations.
Yeah.
It's making me rethink how I view responsibility and blame even in everyday life.
That's a great point, and it really highlights one of the central themes of the book. Chaos theory challenges our simplistic notions of cause and effect. It forces us to consider that responsibility, even in a seemingly chaotic world, might not be so black and white.
This whole deep dive has been like a mental workout in the best way possible. It's definitely making me question some of my assumptions about how the world works.
It's certainly challenging our intuitions, isn't it? And the source material we've been discussing today really drives that point home. It emphasizes that the temptation to fill those gaps in our understanding with free will is a powerful one, but it's important to recognize that as just that a temptation, not necessarily a reflection of reality.
It's like a reality check for our brains, reminding us that the world is a lot more intricate than we might initially think. But where does all of this leave us? It feels like we've been on a roller coaster ride through chaos theory, determinism, predictability, and firing squads. What's the main takeaway for our listeners? Like we've zoomed in and out of this chaotic landscape and realized that even the tiniest details can have massive ripple effects. It's both humbling and kind of exhilarating, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the book actually wraps up with this really thought-provoking idea. It argues that while chaos theory throws a wrench into simplistic reductionist thinking, it also reveals a deeper level of determinism that we might not initially expect.
So it's like saying, okay, we can't predict the future perfectly, but that doesn't mean the future isn't already set in motion. It kind of makes you think about those butterfly effect scenarios, where a tiny change in one place can lead to massive consequences somewhere else.
Yeah. That's a great connection, and the book emphasizes that. The patterns and structures we see emerging from chaotic systems actually point to a more subtle, but still very real form of determinism. It's like realizing that, even though you can't predict every single gust of wind, there are still underlying atmospheric patterns driving the weather.
That's such a great analogy. It makes me wonder, if our brains are indeed these incredibly complex but still deterministic systems, does that make us less responsible for our actions?
Now, that's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries, and it's one that this deep dive doesn't necessarily answer for us. But it does offer a fresh perspective, a new way of thinking about the relationship between our choices and the underlying mechanisms that might be driving them. It's like realizing that even though you feel like you're consciously choosing every step, there might be a complex interplay of neural networks guiding your actions.
It's definitely a lot to chew on. And the book doesn't shy away from these big questions, does it? Yeah. It really pushes you to confront some uncomfortable possibilities.
Not at all. It grapples with the implications of a deterministic worldview, especially when it comes to concepts like responsibility, morality, and even justice. It raises the question, if everything is predetermined, even our choices, does that change how we view right and wrong, praise and blame?
Those are some heavy-duty questions. It makes you wonder if a judge knew for certain that someone's genes predisposed them to a certain type of behavior. Would that change their sentencing, or would we still hold them accountable in the same way?
Right. It forces us to re-examine some of our most fundamental assumptions about how society functions. And the book doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It simply presents these thought-provoking questions and invites us to grapple with them.
And that's what makes it such an engaging read. It's not about giving you a pat answer. It's about sparking a genuine intellectual curiosity. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one big burning question you'd like our listeners to walk away with today?
I think the most important question is this. If our brains are indeed deterministic systems, even incredibly complex ones, does that change how we view responsibility, morality, and even the very concept of justice? It's a question that has no easy answers, but it's one worth pondering.
It's definitely a question that'll stick with me. Well, on that note, I want to thank you and, of course, our listeners for joining us on this incredible journey through the world of chaos theory and free will. It's been a wild ride, and I hope it sparked some curiosity, maybe even a little bit of healthy intellectual discomfort.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the world of knowledge is full of fascinating and unexpected connections. The more we explore, the more we realize how much there is to discover.
That's the beauty of it.
Right.
There's always more to learn, more to question, and more to ponder. So keep those minds open, keep exploring, and we'll